Luke Morrison knew he was beat. He just didn't know how bad. The whiskey in his gut told him to walk away, but the pride in his heart screamed for one more hand. He had $20 to his name, the last of a month's pay for breaking wild horses, and every cent was on the table. The Golden Horseshoe Saloon was thick with smoke, sweat, and bad decisions, and Luke was about to make the worst one of his life. Across from him, Snake Eye Sullivan shuffled the deck, his gray eyes as cold and flat as river stones. He wasn't just a gambler, he was a predator, and he could smell the desperation rolling off Luke in waves. "Last chance, Morrison," Snake Eye hissed, his voice a low purr that cut through the saloon's noise. "Feeling lucky?" Luke wasn't feeling lucky. He was feeling cornered. He'd lost his wages. He'd lost the silver spurs his father gave him. He'd even lost the deed to his horse, a good stallion that was more friend than property. He had nothing left to bet. "I'm out," Luke slurred, pushing his chair back. But Snake Eye's hand shot out, stopping him. "Not so fast, Cowboy. I like your spirit. Let's make this interesting." He leaned forward, the lamplight glinting off his slick-back hair. "One more hand. Winner takes all. I'll even spot you the 100. A murmur went through the crowd pressing in around them. $100 was a fortune. It was a trap, and Luke knew it. Every instinct, dulled as it was by cheap whiskey, told him to run. "What's the catch?" Luke asked, his voice rough. Snake Eye's smile was thin and sharp, like a razor blade. "No catch, just a small condition. If I win, you do one thing for me. Anything I ask. No questions." The men at the table chuckled. It was a devil's bargain, a fool's bet. But Luke Morrison was drunk, broke, and full of a pride that had been his ruin more than once. He looked at the pile of money he'd lost, thought of walking out with absolutely nothing, and the fool in him won. "Deal," he said. The silence that fell over the table was heavy, absolute. Snake Eye dealt the cards with a flick of his wrist. Luke picked up his hand. His heart hammered against his ribs. He had a full house, sevens over kings. It was a beautiful hand, a winning hand. A wave of relief so powerful it almost sobered him up washed over him. He could win it all back. His horse, his wages, his dignity. He slammed the cards down on the table with a triumphant yell. "Read 'em and weep, Sullivan!" But Snake Eye didn't even flinch. He just laughed, a low, cruel sound that chilled Luke to the bone. Then, slow and deliberate, he laid his own cards down one by one. A queen, another queen, a third, and then the fourth. Four of a kind. The room erupted. Luke stared, the blood draining from his face. It was impossible. The hand was impossible. But there they were. The game was over. He had lost everything, and now he owed the devil a favor. "So," Snake Eye said, lighting a cigar and blowing a smoke ring toward the ceiling. "About that condition." Luke felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. What could he possibly want? For him to rob a stagecoach? To burn a rival's barn? He braced himself for the worst. But what Snake Eye said next was worse than anything he could have imagined. "You're going to get married, Morrison." Luke blinked. "Married?" "That's right," Snake Eye said, his grin widening. "By the end of the week, to the widow Johnson." The name hit the room like a physical blow. The laughter that followed was mean and sharp, a chorus of mockery that felt like 1,000 tiny cuts. Amara Johnson. Everyone in Cheyenne Creek knew who she was. A young black woman, beautiful and proud, whose husband had been killed in a mine collapse 6 months prior. She kept to herself, worked her small plot of land, and carried herself with a quiet strength that infuriated the bigots in town. She was the last person on earth they'd ever expect a white cowboy like Luke Morrison to marry. It wasn't just a condition, it was a public humiliation, a joke designed to break them both. "You can't be serious," Luke choked out, his voice shaking with a rage that was quickly replacing the shock. "Deadly serious," Snake Eye replied, his eyes glittering with malice. "A man's word is his bond out here, Morrison. You back out, and you're a liar and a cheat. No one will ever hire you, trust you, or even spit on you if you were on fire. You'll be run out of this territory on a rail." That's when another man stepped out of the shadows. Samuel Blackwood, the town banker. A man who dressed in fine suits and had a smile as cold as a winter morning. "He's right, Mr. Morrison," Blackwood said smoothly. "And to ensure you follow through, there's another small matter." He held up a piece of paper. "I hold the note on Mrs. Johnson's land. Her late husband took out a loan he couldn't repay. The payments are overdue." The trap snapped shut. Luke saw it all with sickening clarity. This was never about a poker game. "You marry her, and I'll consider the debt settled," Blackwood continued, his eyes gleaming. "You refuse, and I foreclose. She'll be homeless by Monday. The choice is yours. Ruin yourself or ruin her. Or perhaps both." Luke stumbled out of the saloon and into the pre-dawn chill, the sound of their laughter clawing at his back. He wasn't just ruined. He was a pawn in a game he didn't understand, a game that was about to destroy an innocent woman's life. He looked up at the pale, empty sky and realized his losing streak wasn't over. It had just begun, and the stakes were higher than he could have ever dreamed. He had been played expertly and cruelly, but as the cold Wyoming air cleared his head, a single dangerous thought took root. They thought they had him trapped. They thought the game was over. Maybe they were wrong. 3 days later, Luke stood at the altar of the small church at the edge of town, sober, stiff, and feeling the weight of every eye in Cheyenne Creek on his back. The pews were packed. It wasn't a wedding. It was a spectacle. The whole town had turned out to see the punchline to Snake Eye Sullivan's cruelest joke. They whispered and snickered behind their hands, their faces a mix of scorn and pity. Luke ignored them, his jaw set like stone. He was trapped, but he'd be damned if he'd give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Then the church doors creaked open. A hush fell over the crowd as Amara Johnson walked down the aisle. Luke had seen her in town before, from a distance. But up close, her beauty was a shock. She wore a simple, carefully mended blue dress that couldn't hide the proud set of her shoulders. Her dark hair was pinned back neatly, and she walked with a grace and dignity that seemed to defy the ugliness of the situation. But it was her eyes that captured him. They were a deep, dark brown, and they held no fear. Only a defiant fire that seemed to burn away the mockery of the crowd. She was a queen walking to her own execution, and she was doing it with her head held high. When she reached the altar, he leaned in, his voice a low whisper. "I'm sorry." Her eyes met his, and there wasn't a flicker of weakness in them. "Save it," she answered, her voice firm and clear. "We both know why we're here. Let's just get this over with." Reverend Mills, a nervous man with sweat beading on his brow, rushed through the vows. His discomfort was so thick you could cut it with a knife. When he got to the part about if anyone has any objections, a wave of cruel laughter rolled through the church. Luke saw Amara's jaw tighten, her hands clench into small fists at her sides, but she didn't flinch. She just stood taller, and in that moment, a strange and unwelcome feeling bloomed in Luke's chest. Admiration. When the miserable ceremony was finally over, the sound of the church bell was drowned out by the jeers of the townsfolk. As they walked back down the aisle together, a married couple in name only, Amara's arm rested lightly on his. The contact was electric. Luke leaned in again, so only she could hear. "A cowboy lost a bet," he murmured, "forced to wed a beauty. But maybe the game's not done yet." Her eyes shot to his, searching his face for a hint of the same mockery she'd seen in everyone else's. She found none. What she saw there surprised her, a spark of defiance, a flicker of a plan. After a long moment, she gave the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. It was a truce, an alliance. That night, they rode in silence to Luke's cabin 5 miles out of town. It wasn't much, a one-room shack with a bed, a stove, a rough-hewn table, and not much else. The wind howled outside, a lonely sound that echoed the emptiness inside him. Amara stood in the doorway, taking it all in. Her small bag was clutched in her hand, but her dignity was still perfectly intact. "It's not much," Luke said, breaking the silence as he lit a lamp. "I've seen worse," she replied, her voice even. She stepped inside and placed her bag on the floor. Her calm was unnerving, but he could see the tension in the rigid line of her shoulders. He wanted to make this easier somehow. "You take the bed," he said, gesturing to the simple cot in the corner. I'll sleep by the stove. No, she said, her voice sharp. The fire was back in her eyes. If you do that, they'll talk. They're all just waiting for this to fail, for us to fall apart. They want to see the joke play out to the end. I will not give them the satisfaction. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the same pride that had carried her through widowhood, through poverty, through the humiliation of this day. This woman was no victim. She was a fighter. He was starting to realize that Snake Eye Sullivan had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He hadn't burdened Luke with a helpless woman. He'd armed him with a warrior. As the lamplight flickered, casting long shadows across the small cabin, Amara knelt and unrolled a quilt from her bag. It was stunning, stitched with intricate, colorful patterns he'd never seen before. It seemed to fill the drab little room with a warmth and life it had never known. That's beautiful work, Luke found himself saying. She looked up, a flicker of surprise in her expression. My mother taught me, she said, and for the first time, her voice softened just a little. It's from her mother, and her mother before that. It's our story. Later, as he lay on a pallet on the floor, staring up at the dark rafters, her voice came quietly from the bed. This marriage may be forced, she said into the darkness, but I won't be. I understand, Luke said quickly, and I meant what I said. The game isn't over. I don't know how yet, but we're going to find a way to turn the tables on them. We'll get through this, with our dignity. The word hung in the air between them, a fragile promise in the vast, howling darkness of the Wyoming night. Outside, the wind whipped across the prairie. Inside, two strangers, bound by a cruel bet, lay awake, listening to the storm. They were trapped together in this sham of a marriage. But for the first time, Luke Morrison didn't feel completely alone. He had an ally, and he had a feeling his new wife was full of surprises. The sun streamed through the cracks in the cabin walls, and Luke woke to a smell he hadn't experienced in years. Fresh coffee and biscuits. Amara was already up, moving about the small space with a quiet efficiency that was both impressive and intimidating. Her back was ramrod straight as she tended the fire, her hands steady. She hadn't just made herself at home, she had taken command of it. You didn't have to do that, Luke said, sitting up and running a hand through his messy hair. I pay my way, she replied, not turning to look at him. I am not a burden, Mr. Morrison. I will not be treated as one. The words should have stung, but they didn't. He heard the fierce pride beneath them. She wasn't just cooking breakfast, she was drawing a line in the sand. She was his equal, and she would be respected as such. They ate in a tense silence at the small table, the space between them filled with unspoken questions. He was trying to figure her out, this woman of iron and fire. He suspected she was doing the same. We need to ride into town, he said finally, pushing his plate away. For supplies. Her shoulders stiffened instantly. I have what I need. No, Luke said, his voice firmer than he intended. You don't. And in the eyes of the law, you're my wife now. What's mine is yours. We're going to town, and you're going to get what you need. End of story. Her dark eyes searched his face, trying to decipher his motives. Was this an order, an act of kindness, or just another part of the charade? After a long moment, she gave a short, clipped nod. They rode side by side, Luke on his bay gelding and Amara on the gentler mare he owned. He was surprised at how comfortable she looked in the saddle. She sat tall and straight, her hands light on the reins, moving with the horse as if she'd been born to it. She was a woman of hidden depths, and he was only just beginning to see the surface. As they rode down the main street of Cheyenne Creek, the town fell quiet. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Men on the boardwalk stopped spitting tobacco to stare. Women peered out from behind their curtains, whispering to one another. It was a gauntlet of hate, and they were walking right into the middle of it. Luke felt a hot flush of anger, but Amara seemed completely unfazed, her expression as calm and unreadable as a deep pool of water. They dismounted in front of Henderson's general store. Mrs. Henderson, a woman with a face like a dried apple, met them at the door, her arms crossed. Well, Mr. Morrison, she said, her voice dripping with disdain, what a surprise to see you with your wife. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," Luke replied, his voice level. "We need supplies." Inside it was worse. The whispers were louder. The stares were longer. Luke gritted his teeth and led Amara toward the bolts of fabric. "Pick whatever you need," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Don't skimp. Winter's coming on fast." Amara hesitated, her hand hovering over a cheap bolt of calico, her face a mask of uncertainty. She was clearly uncomfortable, unused to having anything bought for her. Suddenly, a kind voice cut through the hostile atmosphere. "That calico won't last you the season, dear." They both turned. It was Eleanor Patterson, wife of the man who ran the largest ranch in the valley, the man who sometimes gave Luke work. Mrs. Patterson was a respected figure, a woman of grace and standing. She was smiling, a genuine, warm smile that seemed completely out of place in the cold, judgmental store. "This blue wool, however," she said, touching a much more expensive bolt, "this will serve you well. It's strong, warm. You should choose this." She looked directly at Amara, her eyes full of a kindness that seemed to startle her. "Thank you," Amara said, her voice barely a whisper. "You are very welcome, Mrs. Morrison," Mrs. Patterson replied, putting a gentle emphasis on the name. The effect was immediate. A few of the other women in the store shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Patterson had just publicly acknowledged their marriage, legitimized it in a way that defied the town's mockery. Luke saw a flicker of emotion, gratitude, surprise, maybe even hope, in Amara's eyes before she quickly masked it. He made a mental note. The Pattersons were allies, or at least she was. The rest of their shopping was a battle. The butcher claimed his best cuts were already spoken for. The clerk at the feed store served them with a sullen reluctance, muttering something about orders from a man named Hawthorne. The name rang a bell, but Luke couldn't place it. The worst, however, was at the bank. As they passed, Samuel Blackwood himself stepped out onto the boardwalk, a poisonous smile plastered on his face. "Ah, the happy couple," he boomed, making sure everyone on the street could hear. "Settling into married life, I trust? I do hope you're content with our little arrangement." Luke's hand clenched into a fist. He took a step forward, a hot retort on his lips. But before he could say a word, Amara laid a calm, cool hand on his arm. She stepped in front of him, looked the banker dead in the eye, and her voice, though quiet, carried down the street with perfect clarity. "We are quite content, thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her chin high. "It must be so terribly disappointing for you." Blackwood's smile faltered. He was stunned into silence. Around them, the whispers started again, but this time they were tinged with grudging respect. Luke felt a grin spread across his face as they walked away, leaving the banker sputtering on the boardwalk. "That," he said once they were out of earshot, "was impressive." "Men like him expect fear," Amara replied, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "They feed on it. Sometimes dignity is the only weapon you have left." The ride home was different. The silence wasn't tense anymore. It was comfortable, companionable. Luke kept stealing glances at the woman beside him. Snake Eye Sullivan and Samuel Blackwood had meant for her to be his punishment, his humiliation. They had no idea. They hadn't given him a ball and chain. They'd given him a sword and a shield. That night, as she spread her vibrant quilt over the bed, Luke found himself staring at the intricate patterns, seeing them not just as threads, but as stories of survival, of strength passed down through generations. "Your mother taught you well," he said quietly. "She made you strong." Mara paused, her back to him. Then she nodded slowly. "She did," she said, her voice soft but firm, "and I have no intention of letting her down." A few weeks passed, and a strange rhythm settled over their lives. They were two separate people living in one small space, circling each other like wary planets. They worked side by side during the day, repairing fences, tending to the small garden, and breaking the few horses Luke had managed to acquire. They spoke little, but a current of unspoken understanding flowed between them. He was seeing the woman behind the steely pride. He saw the way she gentled a nervous foal, the skill in her hands as she stitched a tear in his shirt, the quiet sadness in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. He learned that her husband Joseph had been a good man, a strong man, who had taught her to shoot and to stand up for herself. He learned that the mine collapse that killed him had been sudden, mysterious, and had left her with nothing but a piece of land and a mountain of debt. Luke, in turn, found himself opening up in ways he never had before. He told her about his own past, the rambling, lonely life of a cowboy with no roots. He told her about the emptiness that drove him to that poker table, the feeling of always being on the outside looking in. She listened, her dark eyes thoughtful, and didn't offer pity, only a quiet, steady presence that was more comforting than any words could be. They were a team forged in the fires of humiliation, partners in a silent rebellion against the town that had condemned them. But their fragile peace was not meant to last. Trouble came just before dawn one Tuesday. Riding on the backs of 5 horses, Luke was jolted awake by the sound of hoofbeats and angry shouts outside the cabin. He grabbed his rifle from its pegs by the door and peered through a crack in the wall. 5 riders were circling the cabin, their forms dark silhouettes against the rising sun. They weren't just passing through. They were here for a reason. "Morrison!" one of them yelled, his voice a drunken slur. "We know you've got some good horse flesh in that barn. Send 'em on out, and we'll leave your cabin standing." Luke's jaw clenched. Horse thieves, the lowest form of scum on the prairie. "You've got one warning," he shouted back, his voice low and dangerous. "Get off my land now." A chorus of ugly laughter answered him. "Or what, Morrison? You'll sick your new wife on us?" Another rider chimed in, his voice thick with menace. "Maybe we'll just take her, too. See if she's as spirited as they say." A white-hot rage, pure and deadly, surged through Luke. He raised his rifle, ready to put a bullet through the man's black heart. But before he could pull the trigger, the entire cabin shook with a deafening blast. His ears rang. Amara stood beside him, a double-barreled shotgun braced against her shoulder, smoke curling from the barrel. One of the riders screamed, clutching a bloody arm where the buckshot had torn through him. The other thieves reined in their horses, their drunken bravado vanishing in a cloud of gunsmoke. "The next one goes through your heart," Amara's voice rang out, as steady and cold as a tombstone. "I buried one husband. Don't you dare test me on burying a second, or a third, or all 5 of you." There was a moment of stunned silence. The thieves hadn't counted on this. They hadn't counted on the quiet widow being a dead shot with a scattergun. They cursed, circling wider, their confidence shaken, but they weren't ready to give up. 2 of them dismounted and sprinted toward the barn carrying cans. Kerosene. Luke's blood ran cold. The horses, his entire livelihood. They were going to burn him out. "Keep them busy," he whispered to Amara, his mind racing. She didn't hesitate. She just nodded, her eyes fixed on the riders, and began reloading the shotgun with calm, practiced movements. While she laid down suppressing fire, forcing the thieves to take cover, Luke slipped out the back door of the cabin. He moved silently through the tall grass, using the growing dawn light and the shadows of the outbuildings to conceal his approach. He circled around behind them, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. One of the thieves was guarding their horses, his attention focused on the cabin. He never saw Luke coming. The butt of Luke's rifle connected with the back of his head with a sickening thud, and the man dropped like a sack of grain. Luke grabbed the man's pistol, checking the load. Now he had a rifle and a 6-shooter. The odds were starting to even out. He crept toward the barn, where the other 2 were splashing the last of the kerosene against the dry wooden walls. One of them was fumbling with a match. "That's far enough," Luke said, his voice quiet but carrying the promise of death. They spun around, their faces a mixture of surprise and fear. They hadn't seen him. They hadn't heard him. They were caught. One of them made a fatal mistake. He went for his gun. Luke fired without thinking, the pistol bucking in his hand. The man cried out and crumpled to the ground, clutching a shattered leg. The other one, the one with the matches, froze, his hands shooting up into the air. It was over. He had them. But then a low rumble started, a sound that seemed to come from the very earth itself. The ground began to vibrate. The horses, both his and the thieves, started to scream, their eyes wide with terror. Luke looked to the horizon, and what he saw made his stomach drop. A colossal wall of brown dust was rising up, stretching from one end of the sky to the other, glowing an ominous, angry orange in the light of the rising sun. "Dust storm!" the thief screamed, his face pale with terror. In an instant, The situation dissolved into chaos. The remaining conscious thieves forgot all about Luke, the barn, and their wounded comrades. They scrambled for their horses, leaping into the saddles and galloping blindly away, trying to outrun the storm. It was a futile gesture. The wall of dust was moving with terrifying speed, a monstrous, churning wave about to crash over the entire valley. Luke didn't hesitate. He sprinted back toward the cabin, the wind whipping at his clothes, the air growing thick and heavy. "Amara, get inside!" he yelled. He reached the cabin just as she was pulling her head back in from the window, her face grim. He threw his weight against the door, slamming it shut and dropping the heavy bar into place just as the storm hit. The world outside vanished. The sun was blotted out. The day turned into a terrifying, howling twilight. The cabin groaned and rattled under the assault, the wind screaming like a banshee, trying to tear the little building apart at the seams. Dust, fine as flour, poured in through every crack, every knothole, filling the air, choking them. Luke grabbed Amara, pulling her into the center of the room, away from the straining walls. He wrapped his arms around her as the world seemed to come apart around them. The noise was deafening, a physical force that battered them from all sides. He could feel her trembling, or maybe it was him. For hours they clung to each other in the roaring, suffocating darkness, two small figures against the awesome, destructive power of nature. They didn't speak. There were no words. There was only the storm, and the fragile, shared warmth of their bodies pressed together against the cold and the fear. When it finally passed, the silence was as shocking as the noise had been. Slowly, tentatively, Luke unbarred the door and pushed it open. They staggered out onto the porch, coughing the grit from their lungs, and stared at a world transformed. The sky was a hazy, sickly yellow. Everything, the ground, the fences, the water trough, was buried under a thick blanket of fine, red dust, like drifts of alien snow. But the cabin was still standing, and through the haze he could see the barn. The kerosene had been washed away. The animals were alive. They had survived. Exhausted, battered, and covered in grime, they slumped down onto the porch steps, side by side. The adrenaline drained away, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its place. For a long time, they just sat there, breathing in the strangely clean, scoured air. "You were brave," Luke said at last, his voice raspy. Amara managed a faint, tired smile. "I told you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm a survivor." Luke looked at her then, really looked at her. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair was a mess, and her dress was torn. And he thought she was the most beautiful, formidable woman he had ever seen. In that moment, watching her stare out at the scarred landscape with that same unbreakable fire in her eyes, he felt something shift inside his chest. It was more than respect. It was more than admiration. It was something new, something powerful, and something he wasn't entirely ready to put a name to. The storm had passed, but something else had been stirred up in its wake. The dust storm had scarred the land, but it had forged something new between Luke and Amara. The shared danger, the fight for their home, had burned away the last of their reserve. They were no longer just two people forced to live together. They were partners. They worked for days to dig out, clearing the drifts of dust, repairing the damage. Their movements synchronized, their silences comfortable. Word of what happened spread through the valley. Neighbors who had once looked at them with scorn now rode by with offers of help. They brought food, helped patch fences, and spoke of the couple's stand against the horse thieves with a newfound, grudging respect. Amara's courage had become a local legend, but their newfound peace was a fragile thing. The attack hadn't been random. Luke found a branding iron near the barn, half buried in the dust. It wasn't from any of the local ranches. It was a single, stylized H, and he remembered the name the feed store clerk had muttered. Hawthorne, Jeremiah Hawthorne, the most powerful and most ruthless cattle baron in the territory, a man who owned everything and everyone, and who was known for crushing anyone who got in his way. "This was him," Luke said, showing the branding iron to Amara. "He sent those men." Amara looked at the iron, and a flicker of understanding and fear crossed her face. "My husband, Joseph," she said slowly. "He worked in the Hawthorne mine. The one that collapsed. He told me. He told me Hawthorne was cutting corners, using cheap timber to shore up the tunnels. He was going to talk to the federal marshal. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. The mine collapse wasn't an accident. It was a convenient way to silence a whistleblower. And now he wants your land, Luke said, his voice grim. Why? It's not the best grazing land. The water, Amara whispered. Willow Creek runs right through the back corner of my property. It's the only reliable water source for 10 miles. If he controls the water, he controls the whole valley. The game was much bigger and much deadlier than Luke had ever imagined. This wasn't just about a rigged poker game or a public humiliation. It was about murder, greed, and a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. And they were standing right in his way. Hawthorne's pressure became relentless. It was no longer just whispers and stares in town. It was a systematic campaign to choke them out. The general store suddenly ran out of flour whenever they came in. The blacksmith was always too busy to shoe their horses. The bank sent a notice, claiming a clerical error and demanding immediate repayment of a loan Luke didn't even know he had. Neighbors who had been friendly just days before now averted their eyes, threatened by Hawthorne's men if they were seen helping the Morrisons. He's trying to starve us out, Luke said one night, staring at their nearly empty shelves. Come winter, we'll be done for. He felt a familiar despair creeping in, the same hopelessness that had led him to that poker table. But Amara's eyes were blazing. No, she said, her voice filled with a strength that chased the shadows from the room. He thinks he can isolate us. He thinks he can break us one by one. But we are not the only ones he has hurt. It was her idea, a spark of genius born from desperation. They spent the next week riding not to town, but to the small, isolated homesteads scattered across the valley. They talked to the German family whose well had been mysteriously poisoned, the Irish farmer whose fences were cut, allowing Hawthorne's cattle to trample his crops, the Chinese railroad workers who were paid half of what was promised. They found fear everywhere they went, but beneath the fear, they found anger, a deep, simmering resentment just waiting for a spark. Amara was the spark. She spoke to them not as a victim, but as a leader. Her words were simple, powerful, and true. She spoke of unity, of justice, of standing together against a common enemy. Luke watched in awe as this quiet, proud woman transformed into a fiery orator, her passion igniting the hope in these downtrodden people. They called it the Cheyenne Valley Homesteaders Association. They met in secret, in barns and kitchens by the light of flickering lanterns. A patchwork of different families, different backgrounds, all united by a single purpose. They began to fight back, not with guns, but with something Hawthorne couldn't control. They created a cooperative, pooling their resources to buy supplies from a town 50 miles away. They shared tools, traded labor, and stood watch over each other's properties. For the first time, Luke felt like he was part of something. He wasn't just a drifter anymore. He was a husband, a neighbor, a revolutionary. He wasn't just surviving, he was fighting for a future. Hawthorne, furious at this unexpected resistance, struck back harder. He couldn't burn them all out, so he decided to make an example. One of the homesteaders, a young man named Foster with a wife and a small son, was ambushed on his way home. They didn't kill him. They did something worse. They shot him in the leg, a deliberate, crippling wound that would ensure he could never properly work his farm again. They left his little boy to walk the 5 miles home, alone, in the dark. The news hit the community like a death blow. The fear returned, colder and sharper than before. Luke saw the doubt in his neighbor's eyes. Their fragile alliance was beginning to fracture. That night he held Amara as she wept, not for herself, but for the Foster family, for the cruelty that had been unleashed on their community. He wanted to ride out, his rifle in his hand, and put an end to Hawthorne himself. But Amara, even through her tears, stopped him. No, Luke, she said, her voice thick with grief but still firm. Violence is what he wants. It's the language he understands. If you ride out there, you become him. We have to be better. We fight with the law. What law? Luke spat. The sheriff is in Hawthorne's pocket. The whole town is. Then we find a law he can't buy, she said, her eyes clearing. She went to a small wooden chest, Joseph's chest, which she had brought with her. From it, she pulled a worn leather-bound journal. Joseph kept records, she said, her voice low. Dates, names, conversations he overheard. He was building a case. He wrote down everything Hawthorne did to cheat his workers, to bribe officials, to get the deed to the mine. It's all in here. This is our weapon. They spent the night poring over the journal, a meticulous record of one man's quiet courage. Amara's careful notes, combined with her late husband's evidence, formed the backbone of their new strategy. They began to gather more evidence, taking sworn statements from the other homesteaders, documenting every threat, every act of vandalism. They sent copies of everything with a trusted writer to the territorial capital, addressed to a federal judge known for his integrity. It was a long shot, a prayer sent into the wilderness. Weeks turned into a month. Winter began to set in, dusting the prairie with a thin layer of snow. The homesteaders held on, their resources dwindling, their hope wearing thin. There was no word from the capital. It seemed their prayer had gone unanswered. Hawthorne's men grew bolder, riding openly through the valley, their arrogance a constant threat. One cold night, as Luke and Amara sat by the fire, the weight of the world on their shoulders, he finally said the words that had been burning in his heart. "Amara," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "When all this started, that night in the saloon, I thought it was the worst night of my life. I thought I'd lost everything. But I was wrong." He reached across and took her hand. "Losing that bet, it didn't ruin me. It saved me. It gave me you. And you are the best thing that has ever happened to me, Amara Morrison." Her eyes, glistening in the firelight, met his. "I thought my life was over," she whispered. "The day Joseph died, and then the day Blackwood forced this marriage on me. I thought there was nothing left but survival. But somewhere, in all this fighting, in this little cabin, I found more than survival. I found love, real love." He leaned in to kiss her, to seal the truth of their words, to find a moment of peace in the middle of the war. But that moment was shattered by the sound of splintering glass. A bullet ripped through the window, burying itself in the wall just inches from Amara's head. Outside, the night erupted with gunfire and the thunder of hoofbeats. Hawthorne had lost his patience. He had sent his men not to threaten, not to intimidate, but to finish it, to burn them out and bury their hope in the ashes. Luke grabbed his rifle, his heart pounding with a cold, clear fury. "Get down!" he yelled, pushing Amara to the floor. He fired back through the broken window, the blast of his rifle a defiant roar in the night. This was it, the final stand. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and their fight for justice was about to end in blood and fire. But as he looked at Amara, loading her shotgun with the same steady hands she'd shown during the thieves' attack, he knew one thing for sure. They might not win, but they would not be broken. They would face the end together. The cabin became a fortress under siege. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness outside as Hawthorne's men circled, pouring lead into the thin wooden walls. Splinters flew through the air. A bullet shattered the coffee pot on the stove. Luke and Amara moved like a well-oiled machine, firing from the windows, reloading in the dark, their movements economical and precise. They were hopelessly outgunned, but they fought with the ferocity of cornered animals defending their home. "They're trying to get to the barn," Amara yelled over the din of the gunfire. A torch arced through the night sky, landing on the roof of the small stable. The dry shingles caught immediately, flames beginning to lick at the edges. Luke's heart sank. They were being burned out, just like the thieves had tried before. But this time, there would be no dust storm to save them. He knew what he had to do. "Cover me," he said, his voice grim. "Luke, no!" Amara cried, grabbing his arm. "You'll be killed before you take 2 steps." "Our neighbors need to be warned," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "This isn't just about us anymore. If he gets away with this, he'll come for them next." He gave her hand a quick squeeze. "I love you." Before she could argue, he was gone, slipping out the back door and into the chaos of the night. He moved low and fast, the gunfire providing cover for his movements. The night was a confusing mess of shadows, gun smoke, and shouting. He could see at least a dozen of Hawthorne's men, their faces illuminated by the growing fire from the barn. He was never going to make it through them. It was a suicide mission, but he had to try. He took a deep breath, braced himself, and was about to make a desperate run for the cover of the trees when he heard a new sound. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but it grew rapidly louder. It was the sound of hoofbeats. Dozens of them. A whole army of them. For a terrible moment, he thought Hawthorne had sent reinforcements. But then a voice powerful and clear bellowed through the night. "In the name of the law, throw down your weapons!" It was Sheriff Carter, but he wasn't alone. Thundering in behind him was half the valley, the German farmer with his old hunting rifle, the Irish homesteader with a pitchfork, the Chinese railroad workers armed with pickaxes. Even old Mrs. Patterson was there, sitting tall on a white mare, a shotgun resting across her lap. The Cheyenne Valley Homesteaders Association had come. They had seen the fire and heard the shots, and they had ridden to the rescue. Hawthorne's men were caught completely by surprise, trapped between the burning barn and a line of grim-faced, determined homesteaders. The firefight was short and brutal. The tide had turned. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, the hired guns threw down their weapons and surrendered. As the smoke cleared, Luke saw Amara standing on the cabin porch, her shotgun lowered, her face streaked with soot. He ran to her, and they clung to each other, the relief so overwhelming it left them weak. Around them, their neighbors were putting out the fire, rounding up the prisoners. They had done it. They had stood together, and they had won. A few days later, the federal judge from the territorial capital arrived, his buggy escorted by a squad of U.S. Marshals. He had received their package. The trial was held not in the corrupt local courthouse, but in the town's largest church, the pews packed with the entire valley. One by one, Hawthorne's men, facing federal charges, turned on their employer. They confessed to the attacks, the intimidation, the arson. Samuel Blackwood, the banker, was next. His face pale and sweating, he confessed that the entire poker game had been a setup, a conspiracy orchestrated by Hawthorne from the very beginning to get his hands on Amara's land. The courtroom buzzed with outrage, but the most damning testimony came from Amara herself. She took the stand, not with anger, but with a quiet, unshakable dignity. She told the story of her husband, Joseph, and presented his journal as evidence. As she read his words, a meticulous account of Hawthorne's greed and corruption, a heavy silence fell over the church. It was the voice of a good man speaking from beyond the grave, a voice that could not be silenced. Jeremiah Hawthorne, the man who had ruled the valley with fear, sat there, his empire crumbling around him. His land was seized, his assets frozen, his men marched off to prison. He was ruined, utterly and completely. That night, the entire valley celebrated. Bonfires were lit on every hill. Music and laughter, sounds that had been absent for too long, spilled from every barn and homestead. The Cheyenne Valley Homesteaders Association was no longer a secret society. It was a community reborn and stronger than ever. Luke found Amara standing outside their cabin, which their neighbors had already begun to repair. She was looking up at the vast, star-filled Wyoming sky. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "It's finally over." She leaned back against him, her body relaxing into his. "Look at what we did, Luke. Look at what we all did together." He held her tighter. "No more bets," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "No more forced vows. No more fighting for survival. Amara Johnson Morrison, I love you. Not because I lost some stupid card game, but because with you, I've won everything that matters." Tears, bright in the starlight, streaked her cheeks as she turned in his arms and smiled up at him. "And I love you, Luke Morrison. From the ashes of all that hate and humiliation, we built something real, something strong." Months later, as the first wildflowers of spring bloomed across the valley, Amara placed a newborn baby girl into Luke's arms. She had soft brown skin and her mother's fiery eyes. She was perfect. "What should we name her?" Luke whispered, his heart so full he thought it might burst. Amara smiled, a gentle, tired smile that lit up her whole face. "Hope," she answered softly. "Her name is Hope, because that's what she is. She's the proof. Proof that love can grow anywhere, even in the harshest, rockiest ground. Luke kissed his wife's forehead, then looked down at the tiny, perfect life cradled in his arms. The cowboy who had lost everything in a rigged poker game had gained a family, a home, a community, and a love that would become a legend in Cheyenne Valley. As the sun set, casting long, golden rays across their land, Luke, Amara, and baby Hope stood together, a testament to the fact that sometimes the biggest losses lead to the most incredible victories. They had not only survived, they had truly won. If you were moved by Luke and Amara's incredible story of love and justice against all odds, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe for more tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And let me know in the comments below, what do you think was the biggest turning point for them? Until next time, stay safe out there.